It had begun, as so many things do in Oxford, with the sound of rain against old glass, a soft percussion that carried through the room like an apology. I had been seated at my desk, pretending to read, though in truth my eyes lingered more on the condensation tracing hesitant lines down the window than on the page of the novel before me. There are nights when solitude feels almost like company, and that night was one of them. The city was quiet. Even the bells from Magdalen had softened into the distance. Somewhere beyond, a bicycle rattled over wet cobblestones. I remember thinking how the rhythm of its chain sounded curiously slightly uneven, as though the rider carried a heavier conscience than usual. I poured another measure of whiskey and listened until it faded. I have always believed that a case begins long before anyone reports it. The world has a way of hinting at its disturbances, murmuring through small dissonances, a misplaced note in an otherwise perfect chord, a letter left unsent, a silence too carefully maintained. That evening I felt it again, that prickle of quiet inevitability, as though the city were drawing a long breath before speaking a difficult truth. The call came just after midnight. Strange how easily the ring of a telephone can rearrange the architecture of one's thoughts. It wasn't urgent in tone, merely polite, as if the caller were apologizing for troubling me. A body found in the library of St. Friediswide's College. No sign of violence, no immediate explanation. A scholar, apparently. They thought perhaps of a heart attack. They always think that first. I remember the porter's voice, thin with uncertainty. He had locked the doors at 10, he said, and the library had been empty then. The night cleaner had found the man slumped at a reading desk near the philosophy section. His spectacles were still balanced on his nose. I asked if the desk lamp had been on. It had. Somewhere in that small detail I felt the hinge of something. Lamps are not left burning without reason. By the time I arrived, the rain had gentled to a mist, the kind that clings to one's coat rather than falls. The college quadrangle lay under a pale hush, puddles reflecting the faint amber of the lamps. I could smell the wet stone and the faint trace of chalk dust that seems to belong only to such places. The librarian, a woman with pale hands and tired eyes, met me at the entrance. She spoke softly as though afraid to disturb the books. I followed her through aisles that felt like pews, every shelf holding its own congregation of ghosts. The man was still there when I saw him. Middle-aged, neat, his expression composed in that particular way the dead sometimes manage, as if they have already forgiven our astonishment. A volume of Aristotle lay open before him. The page was marked by his left hand. I noticed, almost absently, that it was the wrong hand to have been turning the page. Left-handed people often betray themselves by smudges of ink or the angle of their notes. He had neither. When I leaned closer, I could smell the faintest trace of almonds. The librarian saw me pause and looked away. It is curious how guilt can flicker before there's even been an accusation. I took in the scene, the desk, the lamp, and the paper, with half a sentence unfinished. Words trailing into silence like footsteps fading into fog. And I thought, as I so often do, how death in Oxford feels different from death elsewhere. It arrives with an air of scholarship, as though it too has come to study. Later, standing at the door before leaving, I turned back once more. The light from the desk lamp drew a perfect circle around him, isolating him from everything that had mattered only hours before. I had the sudden impression that he had been waiting for someone, or perhaps for something. I made a note to find out who had last borrowed that copy of Aristotle, and why. The rain resumed as I stepped out. It always does at the beginning of things, It was the kind of morning Oxford wears like a shroud-grey light filtering through drizzle, the towers dissolving into clouds as if the city itself preferred not to be seen. I remember the call came as I was halfway through a crossword, one of those rare clues whose simplicity hides a trap. The word was mercy, and I'd written it too quickly. There's a warning in that, somewhere. The constable's voice was brisk, efficient, untroubled by the weight of the world he was describing. "A body, sir, found hanging in the chapel at St. Cuthbert's, no sign of struggle. Might be suicide." They always start there, as though to reassure themselves that reason might yet apply. I walked. I often did then. The rain made no effort to stop me, nor did it. I have found that walking through Oxford in the wet hours lends one the illusion of detachment, streets turning reflective, almost philosophical. The spires of St. Cuthbert's appeared through the mist, like thoughts I had tried to forget. The porter met me at the gate. His face bore that particular strain of guilt, peculiar to those who believe they should have noticed something sooner. He told me the chapel door had been locked as usual the night before, that no one had been scheduled to enter until morning prayers. But prayers had found something else waiting. The body hung from the ironwork of the chancel screen, motionless, pale against the dim candlelight. A theology lecturer, they said. Dr. Lewis, a man who taught about forgiveness but had few friends to practice it upon. His feet barely touched the worn flagstones, as if he had left this world reluctantly. I noticed his hands relaxed, not clenched. There is peace in some deaths, but not this kind. Beside the pew nearest him lay a small pile of hymnals. Someone had been searching for something, though not divine comfort. The open page of one caught my eye. 322 lead, kindly light, a hymn too deliberate to be chanced. The verger murmured that the chair beneath the body had been moved aside afterward, neatly, almost ceremonially. That word stayed with me. Ceremony. The act of arranging death as a kind of performance. There was no note, no letter, no final rationale left behind, only a half-burned candle on the altar, guttered out as if shamed by the morning. I walked slowly round him, observing what others had already overlooked. The knot at his neck was wrong for a man tying it himself. A small detail, perhaps, but then most truths arrive in whispers. The rope was coarse, newly cut, its fibres still rough. I asked where it had come from, and no one answered quickly. The college gardener spoke at last, reluctant, eyes lowered. He'd kept lengths of rope for securing the ivy along the cloisters. One was missing, he said. He hadn't thought much of it. He looked at the ground as he said it, and I saw the tremor in his jaw. A small tremor, but enough. Later, while the body was being lowered, I wandered into the vestry. The faint scent of incense still lingered, though it hadn't been used in years. On the desk lay a folded sheet of paper, not a confession, but a timetable. Lectures, meetings, the ordinary cadence of academic life. At the corner, a single word scribbled in haste, Cuthbert. The name, of course, of the college, but also of a man long dead, patron of those lost at sea. It is strange, the symbols that persist. Death, after all, is a form of translation, one language ending, another beginning. I thought of the hymn again, its plea for guidance through the encircling gloom. Whoever placed that open book had wanted someone to notice, to understand something half buried beneath piety. When I stepped outside, the rain had ceased. The air was heavy, holding its breath. Across the quad, students hurried between lectures, their umbrellas blooming like dark flowers. I envied them for their ignorance, though not their innocence. I paused at the gate and glanced back once more at the chapel's darkened doorway. The sound of the bells began, low and resonant, marking an hour that felt oddly uncertain. Perhaps it was then that I began to suspect the hanging was not the act of despair, it seemed, but a carefully chosen gesture message written not in ink, but in silence. Some mysteries begin with a scream. Others, like this one, begin with a whisper that refuses to fade. It was in the library again that the first true whisper of intent began to surface. I remember the smell of the place, old paper, lemon polish, and that faint metallic scent that clings to stone after rain. The college had been closed to visitors, but I had persuaded the porter with the mild authority of habit and a few words about duty. He looked relieved to let the matter become someone else's concern. The librarian was waiting, thin and bird-like, her cardigan the same pale grey as the sky beyond the windows. She told me that Dr. Lewis had spent the previous evening at his usual desk, the one beneath the tall window, looking out toward the cloisters. He had requested Aristotle again, and several volumes of Aquinas. His interests, she said, were rarely light. I examined the desk. Dust had gathered in the grain of the oak, disturbed in one place by the pressure of an elbow. A cup of cold tea stood beside a small stack of books, their spines aligned with almost clerical precision. On the topmost Aquinas, Summa Theologica, noticed something peculiar. A slip of paper protruded from the middle, not as a bookmark, but wedged as though to conceal rather than to recall. I got it free. It was a library slip, dated 2 weeks prior. In the margin, a faint penciled note in Lewis's cramped hand. Chef. Psalm 88. I murmured the verse from memory, the old words surfacing like stones beneath dark water. My soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. A curious thing to mark. Theology often skirts despair, but rarely embraces it so neatly. The librarian watched me, uneasy. She confessed that Lewis had seemed distracted of late, irritable with students, absent from several tutorials. He'd mentioned letters anonymous, unsettling, though she hadn't seen them herself. I asked if she could recall anything in particular he had said. Only that they came without signature and spoke of hypocrisy. She had thought he meant academic rivalry. She was wrong, though neither of us yet knew how. When she left me alone, I turned my attention to the margin notes scattered through the pages. Small, compressed observations, half-formed syllogisms, one underlined phrase. The sin that speaks in silence. It seemed less a theologian's remark than a man's confession disguised as thought. On one page he had drawn a small cross beside a line discussing mercy and justice. The cross was faintly smudged, as though rubbed by a nervous thumb. It was then that I noticed another pattern. Every few pages a small circle drawn in the upper corner, precisely placed. I flipped through the book, and when viewed in sequence, those circles aligned in rhythmic code, perhaps, or a simple repetition to soothe an anxious mind. Yet near the end, one circle was missing. I stared at the blank corner longer than the reason required. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping gently on the high windows. I thought of the gardener's tremor, the hymn left open. To lead, kindly light, the note scrawled with the word, Cuthbert. These were fragments, but already they were gathering shape, like brush strokes accumulating into something legible. The absence of that final circle troubled me more than any word could have. I closed the book and caught my reflection in the glass, blurred, uncertain. There are moments in an investigation when you realize you are no longer merely observing the dead, but negotiating with their memory. Lewis had left too much unsaid, yet the margins spoke in their own quiet defiance. Someone else had understood that language someone had written back in kind. As I left the library, I passed a student reading by the buoy fire, her lips moving slightly with the rhythm of her thoughts. I envied her for the simplicity of comprehension. My own mind was already tangled in the unspoken syntax of guilt. The rain followed me out into the quad. It seemed almost deliberate now, like punctuation marking a sentence still unfinished. There is a certain hour in Oxford just before dusk when conversation acquires a strange elasticity. Voices stretch, soften, and then fold into one another like tired smoke. The common room at St. Cuthbert's was steeped in that hour, when I entered a low hum of talk, the faint smell of port and pipe tobacco, and the weight of 100 unspoken hierarchies. It was the sort of place where guilt could sit unnoticed for years, disguised as civility. I had been invited, if that's the word, by the college Diana man with a square jaw and the guarded courtesy of someone accustomed to being right. He spoke of Dr. Lewis with a rehearsed solemnity, the kind that ends precisely where compassion should begin. We are, of course, all deeply shocked. He said it as one might remark on the weather. Around the fire sat 3 other dons. I knew their types before they spoke. The historian, whose confidence was built on forgotten archives, the mathematician, whose gaze remained fixed on some invisible equation, and the chaplain, whose fingers worried at a cufflink like a man praying through habit rather than conviction. I let them talk. They spoke of Lewis's brilliance, his temper, his isolation, and beneath it all I heard the faint strain of relief, the kind that creeps into the voices of those who are glad the difficult man is no longer among them. It was the chaplain who said it first. Lewis was not a man at ease with himself. I asked if he had a reason not to be. A pause followed, delicate as glass. The mathematician shifted in his chair. Perhaps the recent controversy, he murmured. Some academic complaint, an essay withdrawn, a plagiarism accusation whispered, but never proven. The dean frowned, as though tidiness of reputation were his personal creed. Nothing of substance, I assure you. But I had seen enough reputations in my life to know that substance is precisely what institutions fear most. They prefer whisper-sit, keeps the floors polished and the minutes brief. The historian, who had been staring into the fire, finally spoke. He said that Lewis had lately taken to dining alone, that he avoided certain colleagues, and that he had been seen more than once in the company of a young lecturer from the philosophy department, a woman, naturally, though he said it as if the gender were the more scandalous detail. I asked for her name. He pretended not to remember, but I saw his hand tighten around the stem of his glass. The chaplain poured himself another measure of port. I watched the tremor of the decanter, the way it steadied only after a moment. He asked whether I thought Lewis had taken his own life. I said I wasn't sure. It's difficult, I told him, to hang oneself neatly. He smiled faintly, as if unsure whether I was joking. A silence followed. The clock on the mantel struck 6, each chime landing softly in the smoke. I studied their faces in the amber light, each man half concealed, half revealed, the way truth often is. My gaze lingered on the dean's hands, broad, manicured, one fingernail darkened near the edge. Ink, perhaps, or something else. He noticed and folded them away. Before I left, the historian remarked, almost idly, that Lewis had been obsessed lately with marginalia that readers leave behind, thinking they're private. He'd said once that the soul reveals itself in the margins. A curious preoccupation for a theologian. The mathematician laughed softly, but his eyes didn't join in. Outside, the evening had deepened into a grey stillness. I stood beneath the cloisters and listened to the wind move through the arches. There was something in that room, I thought. Something rehearsed, yet fragile, like a conversation, too often repeated. Men talk freely when they believe they are being courteous. They hide best behind their manners. As I walked back toward the gates, I recalled the missing circle in the Aristotle volume, the absent mark that broke the pattern, a small void where intent should have been. The faces in that common room had felt much the same, one expression missing, one truth carefully excised. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise into the damp air. Some mysteries, I've learned, are not constructed by lies, but by the particular shape of what remains unsaid. It was in the afternoon, heavy with that muted light Oxford keeps for itself, when I first saw the misquotation. A line copied from one of Lewis's lectures, printed in the memorial announcement pinned neatly to the chapel notice board. I hadn't meant to notice, it was only that the rhythm of the words felt wrong. It read, "Mercy without justice is weakness, justice without mercy is tyranny." But that wasn't Aquinas, not quite. The original ended differently. "Justice without mercy," he wrote, "is cruelty." Someone had changed the word, cruelty, into tyranny. A small adjustment, and yet it altered the entire shape of the thought, the entire intention of the man who once uttered it. I stood there longer than I should have, reading it again, feeling the quiet tremor of meaning shift beneath the surface. Words, like people, can be doctored to seem more respectable, and sometimes that's the very clue they leave behind. I went to Lewis's rooms later that day. The door opened onto a hush so complete it felt preserved. His bookshelves had been left as they were, lines of theology, classical philosophy, and, curiously, a thin section of poetry. The bed was neatly made, a habit, I supposed, carried over from his years in the seminary. On the desk a fountain pen lay beside a folded sheet of paper that turned out to be blank. I've always thought there is something more revealing about a blank page than one filled with words that suggest either restraint or fear. The porter, a man whose face had been weathered by 40 years of obedience, lingered behind me. He said Lewis had received few visitors except for one, a woman. He couldn't recall her name, but remembered the scent she wore of jasmine, sharp and impossible to mistake. He said it in the tone of a confession. Then he hesitated, as if something else were pressing behind his lips, but chose silence instead. I thanked him and stayed a while longer. The college courtyard below was slick with rain, the flagstones holding the last dim light of the day. I found myself studying the spines of Lewis's books again, as though their arrangement might speak. Near the middle shelf, out of pattern, was a slim volume of Donne's poem Sits Dust Lighter, its edge worn. I pulled it free. Inside, near the beginning, a small annotation caught my eye. In the margin beside a hymn to God the Father, Lewis had written in pencil, "The fault is not mine alone." The line had been underlined twice. I thought of the altered quotation on the notice board, the quiet substitution of cruelty with tyranny, and of how men often soften their own sins when forced to see them in print. Later that evening I returned to the common room, though I told no one why. The same men were there, the dean, the chaplain, and the historian. They spoke now not of grief, but of legacy, already reshaping Lewis into someone they could comfortably remember. The chaplain mentioned that he had written the memorial notice himself, that the misquotation had been chosen because it sounded, as he put it, fittingly moral. I asked him where he'd found it. He smiled faintly. "In Lewis's papers," he said. I suppose he meant it as a compliment. The dean, perhaps sensing something beneath my tone, changed the subject to weather. The historian, whose port glass trembled when he set it down, muttered that Lewis had been a man divided between intellect and faith, perhaps, though he said it vaguely, as if naming division might invite it closer. As I listened, I noticed a small smear of ink on the chaplain's wrist just above his watch, the same dark sheen I had seen before on the dean's thumb. Either coincidence or continuity. Ink, after all, travels easily in rooms built on paper. When I left them, the evening was close and airless. The bells from St. Giles drifted across the roofs, each one echoing longer than the last. I thought again of the line on the notice board, "Justice without mercy is tyranny." Lewis would never have chosen that word. He was too careful with language, too wary of grandeur. Someone had wanted to sound righteous, not truthful. Someone who needed mercy more than justice. I stood under the dripping eaves and lit a cigarette. The rain hissed against the flame, but I kept it burning. In the end, every investigation comes down to language, the words we steal, the ones we misplace, the ones we dare to alter, so we might live with them. And somewhere among those lies, a single truth waits, unedited, refusing to be rewritten. It was raining again that night, not the generous kind that cleans the air, but the thin, persistent drizzle that seems to whisper through gutters and eaves, finding every crevice in Oxford's stone skin. I had been sitting in the dim back room of the police station, staring at the confession laid neatly on the table before me. A single sheet of paper, uncreased, the words written in an almost elegant hand. It looked less like an admission of guilt and more like a sermon, each sentence balanced, each phrase measured for effect. I have learned to distrust beauty in words. It often hides something less symmetrical beneath. The confession belonged to the gardener, though it was clear from the first line it hadn't been written by him. He was a man of few syllables and fewer flourishes. Yet here was a piece of writing that quoted Augustine and closed with a verse from Proverbs. He had signed it, yes, but the ink of the signature was darker, newer than the rest. I found him in the holding room, staring at the blank wall as if it were capable of explaining itself. He said he'd done it, that he had killed Lewis, that he couldn't live with the guilt. The words came too easily, too quickly, like a man reciting lines from a script he hadn't written but was determined to perform convincingly. When I asked him how, he said, with the rope from the garden shed. When I asked why, he said it was punishment, for pride. He could not say whose. He looked like a man confessing not to a crime, but to existence itself. I have seen that before, souls so weighted by self-contempt that they borrow guilt just to give their shame a body. But there was something else to relief, as if confession, even a false one, might finally allow him to rest. I returned to my desk and reread the letter. There, in the second paragraph, a line stood out. He had written, "The sin that speaks in silence cannot be absolved by time." I remembered the same phrase in the margin of Lewis's book, underlined twice. The gardener couldn't have known it. He'd never been inside the library, never handled a single volume from that collection. The phrase wasn't his. It belonged to someone who wrote with precision and control, someone who knew the rhythm of a mind at the edge of revelation. Later that evening, the chaplain asked to see me. He looked pale, drawn, the faint scent of port clinging to his breath. He said the gardener had come to him after Compline, weeping, speaking of sins he didn't understand. The chaplain had advised him to pray, to surrender the burden. I asked what burden. He looked down and said softly, "Another man's." I asked if he had written the confession for him. He hesitated too long. Then no. But his eyes betrayed the impulse of a liar, protecting something he believes is holy. I left him in silence and walked through the empty quad. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of it, cool and metallic. The lamps glowed faintly along the path, their reflections trembling in the puddles like faintly remembered thoughts. Somewhere above, the bell began to toll the late hour, slow, deliberate, as if marking time for the dead. I thought of Lewis's hands, still, folded, and of the missing circle in his book, the break in the pattern. A confession is a kind of circle too, meant to close the gap between guilt and forgiveness. But when the wrong man confesses, the circle never completes. It remains open, like a wound. When I returned to my room, I poured a whiskey and let it sit untouched. I read the confession again, the ink dark under the lamplight, and traced the rhythm of the sentences with my eyes. There was something deliberate in their construction, a measured cadence, almost liturgical. The chaplain's cadence, the same precise hand that had altered Lewis's words on the notice board. The same man, perhaps, who had rewritten a dead theologian into something fit for public mourning. I folded the confession neatly, as if it were something fragile, and slid it into my coat pocket. Tomorrow I would speak to the chaplain again, though I already knew he would deny it. That is the thing about false confessions. They are never truly lies, only truths spoken in the wrong voice. Outside, the last of the rain began again, tapping softly against the window pane, like someone insisting to be heard. I sat in the dark and listened, thinking how guilt, like water, always finds its way back to the surface. It was a quiet morning, the kind Oxford reserves for its own secrets. Mist hung low along the river, drifting through the archways and cloisters like a thought that refused to settle. I had returned to St. Cuthbert's not out of duty, but restless. Something about the gardener's confession, too neat, too eager, had unsettled me. Falsehoods are rarely so polished unless someone has taken care to buff away the truth. The librarian met me at the gate, her thin smile strained by something she was clearly trying not to say. She carried with her a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Found this in the returns room," she murmured, "left in the night drop box with no note." Inside, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue, was a diary, its cover worn, the edges frayed, the kind of object that absorbs both touch and time. Lewis's initials were faintly embossed on the front. The ink inside was his. The entries were sparse at first, dated months apart, but they grew denser as the pages turned more erratic, more urgent. There were fragments of lectures, stray quotations, and private reprimands written to himself. One line stopped me longer than it should have. The truth, once buried, demands witnesses, even unwilling ones. Beneath it, in smaller script, a name: Margaret Hale. It was the first mention of her in anything I had found. The young lecturer from the philosophy department, the one the historian had pretended not to remember, her, handwriting, neat and deliberate, appeared on the next page. She had written in the margin beside a passage on Aristotle's Ethics. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. It is the art of surviving truth. The diary was no longer a record of study. It was a dialogue between Lewis and Margaret, carried out in ink, across weeks or perhaps months. Their marginalia intertwined, crossing like the threads of two minds, circling something dangerous. I sat at the library desk, the morning light flattening against the windows, and read on. There were references to the chapel, to private conversations about sin and scholarship, to a disagreement that had crossed into heresy. Then abruptly the entries stopped. A blank page, followed by one final note written in a trembling hand. "She will not forgive me, nor should she." The librarian asked if the diary would be returned to the authorities. I said no, not yet. Authority, in my experience, is often too eager to close the book before reading the last page. I slipped it into my coat and walked toward the cloisters. The sound of my footsteps caught in the damp echo. Margaret Hale was easy enough to find. She lived in a small flat off Holywell Street, its windows stacked with books that seemed to double as insulation. She looked older than her years, not by time, but by the weight of self-discipline. I told her the diary had surfaced. She said nothing for a long moment, her eyes moving toward the rain-streaked window. Then she said quietly that she had given it back to him once, after their falling out. If it had been found again, it wasn't by her. When I asked what had driven their quarrel, she smiled without warmth. He wanted faith to be logical. I wanted it to be merciful. We were both wrong. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a cigarette, and I noticed a faint stain of ink along her wrist, the same pale blue that had once coloured the ribbon. She caught me looking, and the smile returned, smaller, sadder. She said that Lewis had written to her the night before he died, though she had never opened the letter. She had burned it unopened, afraid that the words would ask her to understand what she could not forgive. Back outside, the rain had gathered strength. I walked past the chapel, its doors closed, its windows clouded with condensation. Inside, I imagined the hymn books lined in patient silence, their pages still marked by the dead man's hand. I thought of the gardener's confession, the chaplain's guilt, the dean's careful erasures, and I thought of that diary, half prayer, half apology, written in two voices but ending in one. The last line lingered in my mind. Truth demands witnesses. Perhaps that was what Lewis had wanted, not absolution, but remembrance, the kind that doesn't comfort, only endures. That night I poured a whiskey and opened the diary again. The rain outside deepened to a steady rhythm, like the turning of unseen pages. Somewhere between confession and silence, the words began to sound almost human. It was late afternoon when I found myself once again in the lecture hall at St. Cuthbert's, the air still faintly scented with chalk and stale intellect. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, tracing the high windows like thin handwriting. Someone had left the blackboard untouched since Lewis's last class, the faint remnants of equations and quotations still clinging to the surface like ghosts. I stood there for a while, listening to the emptiness. Classrooms hold silence differently. It pools rather than echoes, as though the walls themselves are remembering what was said within them. The dean had allowed me access reluctantly. He claimed the room was of no consequence, that it contained nothing I hadn't already seen. That was true enough in the visible sense, but I had learned long ago that meaning rarely announces itself. It hides in small domestic corners in what has been erased and what hasn't. Lewis had lectured here twice a week on theology and moral reasoning, a narrow field but fertile for the sort of man who believed words could be measured like proof. I scanned the room. The desk at the front was immaculate, except for a folded sheet tucked beneath a glass paperweight. It was a page from a student handout, covered in notes, written in Lewis's small, exacting script. At first glance, ordinary. But the longer I looked, the more deliberate the underlinings appeared. Every third word marked, every seventh crossed. A rhythm, not of emphasis, but of pattern. I copied the sequence onto a scrap of paper, half from habit, half from instinct. There were 21 words underlined, 7 of them forming a separate thread of thought when read alone. Truth is not found, it is left behind. I read it twice, the phrase sounding less like instruction and more like confession. I searched the desk drawers, nothing but stationery, lecture notes, and one unopened envelope addressed to the chaplain. The handwriting was precise, the kind of hand that fears misunderstanding. I hesitated, then slid the letter into my pocket. There are moments when curiosity is less a vice than a duty. At the back of the hall, rows of chairs stretched out beneath the dim light, each one worn smooth by decades of indifferent students. I took a seat halfway back, the vantage point from which one observes without being observed. From there I noticed the faint shadow of chalk dust on the wall, to the right of the board, not writing exactly, but residue. A few strokes, rubbed but not erased entirely. I stood, angled the light, and traced the fragments with my fingertips. It wasn't text, but numbers, 312, 74, 922 verses perhaps, Scripture. I recognized the structure immediately. A man like Lewis would have chosen verses not at random. I returned to my room that night and pulled down an old Bible, its pages dry and brittle with neglect. I followed the references one by one. The 3rd chapter, 12th verse, Psalms. The 7th chapter, 4th verse, Proverbs. The 9th chapter, 22nd, Job. Together the verses formed no coherent prayer, but something stranger. Each spoke of judgment deferred, of silence mistaken for virtue, of the burden of knowledge. A message assembled from borrowed wisdom, meant to be deciphered only by someone listening carefully enough. I thought of Margaret Hale then, of her ink-stained hands and the quiet resistance in her voice. She would have recognized the pattern. Perhaps it had been meant for her, the final riddle of a man already preparing his own absence, but she hadn't come to that last lecture. The chaplain had. The following morning, I confronted him in his study. He was seated by the window, pale light slanting across the collar at his throat. He said he had nothing more to add, that grief was best left to fade naturally. I asked if he had attended Lewis's final lecture. He nodded. I asked if he remembered the topic. He said it was on repentance. Then more softly, in silence. I placed the folded hand out on his desk. His eyes flickered once, a movement too brief to measure. He said he didn't recognize it. I believed him at least. I believed the part of him that wanted to. When I left his office, the afternoon light had turned the chapel windows to amber. The students passing in the quad spoke in low voices, unaware of the private histories still rustling behind the stone. I walked beneath the archway and thought of Lewis's phrase against truth is not found, it is left behind. That night I opened the envelope. Inside a single page, the handwriting, careful as ever, read only this: "Forgive what cannot be spoken." There was no signature, but none was needed. In Oxford, truth has a way of speaking through omission. And sometimes that is the only language we deserve. It was nearly dawn when they called me. The kind of hour when the city forgets itself, when the rain has stopped, but the pavements still shine with the memory of it. I had not been sleeping, only drifting between thoughts too quiet to silence. The voice on the telephone was calm, almost apologetic. Another death at St. Cuthbert's, the chapel again. I walked there alone. The air was brittle, as though the world had held its breath all night and was uncertain whether to exhale. The gates were open. Beyond them, the quadrangle lay in a thin mist, the lamps still burning, halos of tired gold trembling in the damp. The body hung from the same place as before, the same ironwork of the chancel screen, but this time it was not Lewis, it was the chaplain. He looked smaller in death, as if repentance had compressed him into something fragile. The rope was knotted cleanly, efficiently. There was no sign of struggle, no chaos. A chair placed neatly to the side, its legs aligned with geometric care. On the altar beneath him lay a single page from a Bible, torn cleanly from the Gospel of John. The verse, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends," was underlined in a trembling hand. The constable standing nearby whispered that it must be guilt, that he had helped Lewis die, or at least failed to stop him. I said nothing. There are forms of guilt that imitate devotion so perfectly that even the guilty can no longer tell the difference. I stepped closer. The rope was the same kind as before, the same coarse fibre from the gardener's supply, the same knot reversed. My eyes caught a faint mark on the chaplain's wrist, a faint burn line, half-healed. Rope burn, old, weeks at least. It was not the first time he had held such a line. A small pile of hymnals had been stacked at the pew nearby. Another echo, but this time the top book was open to a different hymn number 125, O God of Truth and Love. The words, blurred by a fallen drop of wax, read not as prayer, but as resignation. I told the constable to leave it untouched. I sat for a moment in the front pew, listening to the faint hum of the lights. It is strange how death repeats itself when the living refuse to understand it. The dean arrived not long after. His eyes were red, though not from tears. He asked if I believed in coincidence. I told him I believed in patterns. He said that the chaplain had been distant lately, speaking of redemption of duty. He had insisted on leading prayers the previous night, though no one had attended. He had dismissed the gardener hours before the body was found. I asked to see the gardener. They said he'd vanished sometime during the night. The door to his quarters had been left open, a small kettle still warm on the stove. On his table lay a torn piece of paper, no larger than a playing card. It bore only a single line. He asked me to help. I returned to the chapel at first light. The dawn had begun to break through the windows, the colours faint and exhausted. I stood beneath the hanging body and noticed, at last, what I had missed before. The rope, though tied around the beam, was looped twice, once in the opposite directional correction, as if someone had been teaching him. The hymn book on the altar had a folded note pressed between its pages. It was written in the same careful hand as the confession I had found earlier, but the ink was older, faded at the edges. It read, "Forgive what cannot be undone. Speak not of mercy, only silence." I left it there. Some words are best left unread by the living. Outside, the morning had turned from silver to pale gold. The bells began to ring again, slow and deliberate, as if mourning the repetition of their own sound. I walked back across the quad, the mist lifting now, revealing the sharp outlines of roofs and chimneys. I thought of Lewis, of his coded lecture, of the missing circle in the margins. Perhaps this was the circle's completion, not truth, but symmetry. I have often wondered since whether the chaplain hanged himself from faith or fear, or whether the two, in the end, are indistinguishable. I have come to believe that revenge, when it finally arrives, seldom declares itself. It enters like a scholar quietly, armed with evidence and reason, convinced of its own righteousness. It was that kind of vengeance that had taken hold of St. Cuthbert's. Subtle, precise, and cloaked in intellect. The college had settled into a strained calm after the chaplain's death. The dean called it closure, as if death could ever be an administrative task. The students whispered less, though silence in Oxford is never innocent. It is only a different form of noise. I returned there one afternoon, drawn not by duty but by the unease of unfinished symmetry. The librarian met me again, her face pale beneath the library's greenish light. She had been cataloguing Lewis's papers for the archives. Among them, she said, she had found something strange, an unsigned manuscript, dense with theological argument, marked throughout in 2 different inks. I took it from her and read the first line aloud to myself. There are sins that can only be redeemed by repetition. The handwriting was unmistakable, Lewis's neat hand interwoven with the marginal notes of another philosopher, Margaret Hale. What began as commentary had turned into something like correspondence, a dialogue of accusation and correction. And near the end, the tone shifted. The notes became sharper, almost cruel. Her words cut across his, a challenge that read less like academic criticism and more like condemnation. You hide behind intellect to avoid compassion. There were faint smudges at the corner of one page where the ink had run. Not water, I thought, not rain. A hand trembling, perhaps, or an argument ending too late. When I asked the librarian where she had found it, she said it had been misfiled in the philosophy section beneath a volume on moral paradox. misfiled, she called it. But I knew the word she really meant was hidden. I went to see Margaret that evening. Her flat was dark, the curtains drawn against the fading light. She let me in without surprise, as though she had been waiting. Her voice was calm, distant. She said she had heard about the chaplain, that she had once admired him before she learned admiration could be dangerous. I asked her if she had written those final notes in Lewis's manuscript. She didn't answer. Instead, she asked whether I believed a person could be guilty of another's death simply by watching them destroy themselves. I said that omission was its own kind of cruelty. She nodded, her hand tightening around a glass that had long since stopped holding wine. Then she told me that Lewis had once accused her of intellectual vanity, that he had said she cared more for argument than truth. She had replied that truth, unlike faith, did not need defending, it only needed witnesses. The words had stayed between them like a fracture no apology could mend. When he died, she said, she had felt nothing at first. Only later, when she learned of the chaplain's role, his forgery, his false redemption, did she feel the sting of something darker, the scholar's desire for balance, for correction. She had sent letters to the dean, anonymous, each one quoting passages from Lewis's lectures twisted slightly, like reflections in a warped mirror. And when the chaplain had confessed his sin publicly, she said she hadn't expected him to answer it with death. I asked her what she hoped to achieve. She looked at me then, finally, her eyes tired, but unflinching. Not revenge, she said, recognition. That was worse, I thought, though I didn't say it. On my way out, I noticed a book lying open on her table. The same Aristotle volume I had seen in Lewis's library, the one marked with the missing circle. The blank corner now filled in, drawn lightly in pencil, a small, closed loop. I traced it with my eyes before leaving. The pattern was complete. Outside, the air was thick with evening rain. The city's spires faded into greyness, their outlines dissolving like thoughts half forgotten. I walked toward the river, where the water carried the faint scent of smoke and stone. Somewhere behind me, a bell began to ring, slow and deliberate, each toll measuring what had been lost and what refused to stay buried. I thought of Lewis, of the chaplain, of Margaret's calm defiance. Revenge, after all, was never an act of rage. It was the quiet insistence that justice must take the shape of memory. And Oxford, in its endless patience, remembers everything. There is something strangely merciful about Oxford at dawn. The city forgives itself each morning, wiping its conscience clean with mist and the faint hum of bells. I remember walking through the empty quad of St. Cuthbert's one last time, the stones slick with rain, the air faintly metallic, as if the past hours had left a residue on the world. The case of what passed for one was over, though nothing in Oxford ever truly ends. It only settles into quieter forms of persistence. The college was subdued, emptied of its whispers. The chapel doors were bolted now, the rope removed, the hymnals locked away. The dean had resigned, citing health. Margaret Hale had taken leave from her lectures, her rooms dark behind drawn curtains. The gardener never returned, though someone swore they saw him once in Gloucester tending a churchyard. I doubted it. The living are rarely so devoted to the dead. I stopped outside Lewis's old rooms. The key still fits the lock, though I shouldn't have tried it. The air inside was undisturbed, heavy with that mixture of dust and thought peculiar to academics who mistake solitude for immortality. His desk remained as it had been left, a few stray papers, a cold pipe, a small brass lamp that refused to give more than a wan, sepulchral light. On the shelf above, the Aristotle volume waited. I took it down again, ran my thumb along the spine, and opened it to the page I already knew, by heart. The final circle Margaret had drawn was still there, faint as breath. There was something I hadn't noticed. Before, a penciled line beneath it, so faint it was almost imagined. I held the page toward the window. 3 words emerged, hesitant, unfinished. All knowledge fails. It was not a conclusion. It was a surrender. I thought of the coded lecture, the false confessions, the careful choreography of guilt that had danced through those cloisters. Lewis had wanted absolution, but not from God. He wanted someone to read his life as he read Scripture, with interpretation, not judgment. The chaplain had mistaken obedience for faith, Margaret had mistaken honesty for redemption, and I, perhaps, had mistaken curiosity for duty. I sat there a long while, listening to the rain resume its patient rhythm against the glass. The sound reminded me of the way truth sometimes arrives, not as revelation, but as repetition. There was no murderer here, not in the way the law understands it. Only a series of hands passing the same burden until one of them finally let it fall. A photograph rested on the mantel, one I had not seen before. Lewis and Margaret, younger, smiling in that careful, formal way scholars smile for posterity. Between them, a faint distance, the kind that belongs not to strangers, but to people who have known too much of each other. On the back, in his handwriting, for the record, not remembrance. I replaced it, closed the door behind me, and left the room as I had found it, suspended in that fragile state between meaning and oblivion. Outside, the first sunlight was beginning to filter through the drizzle, gilding the rooftops with false warmth. The porter passed me without meeting my eye. He asked, absently, whether everything was settled now. I said yes, though we both knew that in Oxford nothing ever is. That night, back in my own rooms, I poured the last of the whiskey and opened my notebook. I had tried once to write it all down in the tidy sequence that reports require. The dates, the deaths, the evidence that never quite amounted to proof. But the narrative refused order, spilling into digressions and half-thoughts. I realized then that the truth of it was not in the events themselves, but in their margins, the hesitation before a word, the silence after a prayer, the distance between 2 people on a page. I wrote only one line in the end. We never solve the problem of living. We only annotate them. It seemed sufficient. Outside, Oxford slept beneath a wash of pale moonlight, its spires softened by mist. Somewhere in one of those towers, a light still burned in a scholar's room, steady and unrepentant. The city would wake again tomorrow, and the same rain would fall, and someone else would misread the past with conviction. I drained the glass, closed the notebook, and let the quiet return. In the end, that is all a detective can offer: a footnote to life, written too late to change the text.